1.
Christ's College Canterbury Amendment Bill Committee stage.
I declare the House in committee for consideration of the Christ's College Canterbury Amendment Bill.
Mr Speaker.
Mr Chairman.
Members, the House and Committee on the Christ's College Canterbury Amendment Bill. The question is that the preamble stand part. I call Brendan Burns.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. I'm very pleased to take part in the committee stages of the Christ's College Canterbury Amendment Bill, and note that Christ's College is an iconic institution at the heart of my electorate of Christchurch Central. It's got a very proud history through somewhat challenging times over the decades, through 2 world wars, through the Great Depression, and now most recently and very, very recently through the quake of September the 4th, and of course more recently the severe aftershock of yesterday. And pupils and teachers at Christ's College were among the many thousands of people who were rattled by yesterday's Force 5 quake. But I can say this, that Christ's College, like Christchurch and Canterbury, are coming through the quake and the aftershocks, and while we are shaken, we are not stirred. Christ's College, as some members may know, has around 150 trusts, and about 20 or 30 are at the heart of this bill. They are trusts that deal with causes that may have been appropriate in the past, but no longer are appropriate. And to give us an example, perhaps, a trust which in the past may have devoted funds towards the teaching of Greek for pupils, and then are not large numbers of any boys at Christ's who feel the same need to learn Greek, and of course the trusts of such trusts were there to provide assistance to such boys should they wish to. Now, I suppose it could be argued that you might use such funds and such a trust to send boys off to the Greek islands and Athens to study Greek, but then that would raise a question as to whether that was a charitable purpose as the original trust deed intended. And the bill is explicit around this, and in fact there are amendments made to reinforce the fact that there should only be use of funds for charitable purposes. The point is that these are not always easy to define. Now, for instance, if there were a trust to encourage democratic participation, trustees might use that money to, say, hire the Christchurch Town Hall, a considerable cost actually, to allow major public discussion on an issue of sub-public consequence, say like the Christchurch earthquake. But then the trustees would need to be sure that this was not just a charitable purpose for a particular individual, but also a wise use of those trust funds. So I guess trustees would have to ask the question that what if, after considerable expense, that democratic funding that they were funding was only attracting 100 people? Would that be a wise use of trust funds? Would it be a charitable purpose being served? And if an intended beneficiary of those funds then advised people in Christchurch with quake claims that had not yet been addressed, that perhaps they could resubmit them to the Earthquake Commission, would that be a wise use of those funds when 100,000 claims had already been lodged with the Earthquake Commission? Is that just a double up, or is that double Dutch? So, quite wisely, the Board of Trustees of Christ's College has come to Parliament seeking a solution, to seek a law change so that funds held in the trusts, the 20 or 30 trusts covered by this bill, which may in the past have been used for something like Greek or double Dutch, some language or strange practice that's been left behind by time or by wiser heads, can now be better spent. And that's really the thrust behind this bill. And I'm pleased that, and the Labor Party is pleased, that there have been changes made at the Select Committee to tighten up on the purpose of the trusts. This bill is about increasing flexibility for Christ College. It is, of course, a private school in Christchurch, and it's about making sure that there is better use of funds, better use made of property than it might have been used for in the past and what it is still vested for. That's at the heart of this bill. And we are very keen to see that the bill is allowing trustees to vary the purposes of the charitable trusts in particular circumstances. And obviously there has been at the Select Committee consideration. Mr Chair, there has been consideration at the Select Committee about consideration of the wording of the Act and the Charitable Trusts Act under which the trusts operate to describe the particular circumstances in which a governing body may vary the purposes of charitable trusts. This is an issue familiar to me because last year the first bill I had the privilege to introduce through this House was that for the Methodist Church, and they were in a very similar situation to the Christ's College Board of Governors, where trusts had been established back in the mists of time for particular purposes, mostly relating to the care of orphans. That was no longer a concern for the Methodist Church, but that's what the trusts were locked into so doing. And so the only way that you can amend those trusts, unless you have an Act of Parliament like this, is to have an approach to the High Court, which can cost tens of thousands of dollars for a particular trust. And as has been said, when Christ College has 20 or 30 trusts locked up with assets, with funds, that they can no longer use those purposes for something like teaching Greek. They need the flexibility to be able to apply those funds across. But the Select Committee was concerned to make sure that the governing body, while it may vary the purposes of those funds, that they still were used for a charitable purpose. And so the Select Committee, of course, reported back and recommended inserting the clause around trust property only be used for charitable purposes even when there has been a variation. And that is a welcome change because it reinforces what were the intentions of the original trustees, those who set up trusts, perhaps if they had sons at the school and wanted to recognise sons or sons who'd been lost in war. There was a roll of honour for the two wars and others, for former pupils who, of course, wanted to be remembered by their families. Trusts were established. That's quite a usual circumstance for the establishment of such trusts. And so a particular purpose was defined, and now, as time moves on, the Board of Governors wants the capacity to be able to vary those trusts. So that's why we've got this bill in front of us. The actual bill is amending things that have been made redundant by the passage of time, which have become uncertain as to their application, which have become impractical to implement. And clearly, where a property is generating income that's inadequate or in excess of the amount necessary for the purposes, sometimes we're wanting to see the amalgamation of particular trusts' funds into one fund and the devotion of that to new purposes, whilst it's still charitable, as our amendments before the House suggest, are still able to change from the original purpose. So that's important. So what this bill is about is authorising the governing body of the college to apply property in certain circumstances for the benefit of the college, but where there is still going to be some change. That's a very welcome move. And I think that there is flexibility carried through in this bill to make better use of property that's been vested in the board, very fine board. It's a good school. It's got a proud record. It's got a number of former pupils familiar to this House. One well known to this side of the House in the form of one Michael Cullen. So it's got a proud record. This bill gives it the flexibility to vary the purposes of those trusts in particular circumstances. I'm pleased to see those changes brought forward by the Select Committee, suggested to the House to make sure that where there's variation, it still only comes back to charitable purposes. That's very, very clear because there was just a residual concern, I think, while the purpose of the original bill was to devote benefits for the benefit of the college. if in some extraordinary set of circumstances the benefits of the college were not in line with charitable purposes, that's why we've seen that amendment come through. So that's a very, very welcome change by the Select Committee. The bill's now back in front of us here at the committee stages. That gives us the final chance for some scrutiny, and that's important.